Hello and welcome to Cognitive Aging. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is basically overview the whole field. So I'm going to touch on a lot of different subjects and just kind of work my way down through them. So first I'll discuss biological changes. So what's going on inside the brain. And then I'll talk about moderating variables. So variables that influence the aging process. I'll talk about mental status, attention, executive function, memory, language, and visuospatial functioning. So basically, this is just an overview of everything that we're going to cover in the class for the most part, with a few exceptions. So starting off, what are the biological changes? Well, the first thing to note is that when we look at the brain as it ages, is that the decline is not uniform. So what that means is some areas show atrophy before others. And one way to break it down is just to notice the different lobes. So you may know the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe, which is involved in decision-making, higher order activities, this is the area that shows the greatest decline. So the frontal lobe is disproportionately affected relative to the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. And lots of research shows this. You can look at volume based on MRI. So you can take a look and you can see that there's actual shrinkage in that area. And then also you can use another tool called diffusion tensor imaging. And what you can see there is that there's also declines in white matter. So just to talk about the difference really quickly, gray matter, this is the cell bodies, and white matter, these are the connections between areas. So those are all the axons. So outside of the frontal lobe, another area that shows a great amount of degradation is the hippocampus. So if you're not familiar, the hippocampus is important in creating new functional memories, and it's found in the medial temporal lobe. So just in the middle of the temporal lobe is where it's found. And this shows changes in normal aging, but the process of it shrinking is much faster for individuals who have Alzheimer's disease. So what we see, one way to index brain changes, brain loss over time is to look at the size of what are called the ventricles. So ventricles, they hold what's called cerebrospinal fluid. And basically what cerebrospinal fluid does is it helps clean out the brain. And if we lose brain matter, our brain itself can't completely shrink, because if it does, it would rattle around in the head. And instead of that, what happens is the ventricles that hold the cerebrospinal fluid, they expand and become larger. And what we see is that there's an acceleration from less than 0.5% for younger adults all the way up to probably about 4% in adults over 70. What are some other major findings that we have? Well, one really big finding is that older adults, their brains recruit additional areas to help them with cognitive tasks, where younger adults can focus on just one area will be enough to do different cognitive tasks. Older adults tend to recruit on extra areas. And we'll talk about this in a lot more detail later. So it's not overly necessary to go too in depth right now, because we'll have articles that talk about this in the future. So what are some moderating variables that affect the aging process? Well, first, one thing to note is that for any age group, there's a ton of individual differences. And what we see for older adults is that there's even more difference between individual, more variability than for younger adults. Because as younger adults, we kind of start off in a similar spot. And with life trajectories, what we end up doing, there becomes larger and larger differences between individuals. Some remain healthy, some live less healthy lives. So one thing that's shown to be extraordinarily good for us is to have high levels of education. So what we find is that with years of education, we tend to have higher levels of cognition. So cognitively, we tend to be more healthy, that our brain tends to atrophy less. And also we're less likely to develop symptoms of dementia. So what are some other things that affect the sensory process? the aging process. The sensory processes are one of them. So some research has shown that degradation of the eyes and sensory processes is one of the most correlated pieces of information related to cognition. So we'll get into that later. So that's one theory. Another theory has to do with a neurotransmitter called dopamine. You might be familiar with dopamine. It's the primary reward chemical in the brain, but it's also deeply involved in cognition. And some people suggest that it's actually changes in dopamine that lead to cognitive changes later. Another theory suggests that age-related changes are due to the frontal lobe. And it's true to some extent that there's large changes in the frontal lobe, but not all areas of the frontal lobe are impacted. And we'll talk about that later. Another theory is that older adults struggle with something that's called inhibition. And basically what that is the ability to filter out information. So say you're asked to pay attention to something in particular. If you have good inhibition, you're able to filter out all of the other things. But if you struggle with that, like individuals with ADHD, they tend to allow more things into their mind at once, also known as working memory or short-term memory. And it can be distracting and it can make it very difficult to process information. Another moderating variable is called speed of processing. So some people suggest that age-related differences between younger and older adults are due simply to how fast people process information. And on average, older adults tend to process information a bit more slowly. And what that means is that they might not be able to complete a task in their mind in enough time before they forget it. And perhaps they're not able to link additional pieces of information together because it takes them longer to process individual pieces. So that's one theory. Next, let's talk about mental status. So the MMSE is the mini mental state examination. And basically this is used to detect dementia or mild cognitive impairment. And in this chapter, or I guess in this article, they just spoke for a few moments about it. And what they said was that it's not a perfect measure. So basically, there's no perfect measure to figure out if someone's showing early signs of dementia, but this is one way to go about it. And one of the issues it has is that it has a lot of false positives. So individuals with low IQ or fewer years of education tend to score lower on it. So it might not be a sign of dementia necessarily, but they might test positive. Next, let's talk about attention. So attention is something that we all have and we all need. So basically we can only pay attention to so many different things that are going on in our environment in the same time. And being able to prioritize what we pay attention to is vital for our well-being. And scientific studies show that attention predicts auto accidents. So those that struggle with attention tend to be more likely to get into accidents. And attention, just like memory that we'll get into in just a little bit, has a lot of different moving pieces in it. And one type of attention is called sustained attention. And this is the ability to focus on information and continue working on it for a really long period of time. So say that you're driving a car. That would be a good example of sustained attention because you'll be doing it for like 20 or 30 minutes at a time. And what we see is that older adults actually do quite well with this. They can pay attention for long periods of time. That's not really an issue. What older adults have more trouble with is what's called selective attention. So in selective attention, you have to do two things. You have to select what's important to find in the scene. So you have to figure out what you need to pay attention to, which is one piece that older adults are actually pretty good with. Where older adults struggle is an inhibitory control that we've talked about before, which is basically the idea that things are entering into your mind that shouldn't be there. You're not paying attention to the right things. So you're not selecting the right things to pay attention to. And this is something that heavily predicts car crashes for older adults. Next, older adults tend to struggle with divided attention / task switching. So basically the idea is that switching quickly between one task to another, multitasking, doing different things at once. Older adults have a bit more trouble dealing with that. Next, talk about executive functioning. So executive functioning is simply just higher order constructs, and basically it's the idea, like it's involved in like problem solving, goal directed behavior, organization of information. And what we see is that in general, older adults struggle with this a bit more than younger adults. And probably the reason why is the actual mechanism beside with executive functioning is called working memory. And working memory is the ability to handle pieces of information and organize them, compare and contrast them, and do different like comparing operations with them. So in working memory, you have to be able to, for instance, figure out a whole bunch of different choices and figure out which one's best, or you have to be able to handle all this information and manipulate it in different ways. It's really important for things like math and problem solving. And what we see is in general, older adults struggle with that. Next, let's get into memory. So just like attention, it's not a single construct. A lot of times people say my memory is good or my memory is bad, but in reality, memory is a lot of different things. So the first piece we'll talk about is called episodic memory. And episodic memory is the ability to remember like episodes of our daily lives, being able to remember the actual contextual details of how things happened and the order that they happened. It's like you're actually going back in time and remembering everything that took place. And in general, older adults struggle with episodic memory. This is one of the things that they struggle with the most, is creating these new functional memories that have all of the contextual details. So while older adults struggle with episodic memory, they do really well with what's called semantic memory. And semantic memory is the ability to hold on to different details. So when looking after like or recalling events that happened to us, this is also called autobiographical memories. What we find is that older adults do well with like the general details and the gist, which is semantic memory, which is basically the knowledge and the ideas behind what happened, but they struggle more at the episodic pieces. So remembering like what someone said at this time and all of the different individual details. Next, familiarity. Older adults tend to stay just about as good at familiarity. Older adults tend to be more susceptible to false memories. So there's been a whole bunch of different ways to look at this. One of the most popular ways to do this is to display a bunch of names and then to ask them later if the names that they saw in a new list of names are famous people. So basically what happens is they confuse familiarity with someone being famous. And it's just kind of one of the ways the older adults are more susceptible. Another thing that older adults are a little bit more susceptible to is what's called source memory. So it's remembering where you learned information from. And this can be vitally important in today's age because not all sources are as credible as other ones. You can definitely find and come across some fake news. And if it enters in and it becomes a memory and you don't realize where you heard it from, you thought you heard it from a reputable source, then that could be a problem. Other types of memory, flashbulb memory. This is basically being able to recall a huge, like important emotional events. These tend to stay relatively stable. So for older adults, some of these might be Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Figure out, it's like an episodic memory. So being able to recall where you were, what you were doing, all the different things that were happening then. It's just a special type of episodic memory. And also older adults show some changes in perspective memory. So basically what that is remembering to do things in the future. So an example of perspective memory would be to take your medication, for example. Next, let's talk about language and visuospatial processing. So language is mostly intact. In fact, older adults tend to have larger vocabularies than younger adults. Vocabulary falls into the domain of semantic memory. It's just the meaning of different things. So older adults do pretty well with language overall. There's only a couple things that tend to get in the way. Older adults struggle with retrieval. So the memories are there. They're just not readily accessible at points. And what you see happen more with older adults than younger adults is something called tip of the tongue, which is where they know the word. It just takes them a little bit more time to access it and to retrieve it, but it's there. And what you see also are slightly more pauses, ums to fill up spaces that are pauses. And lastly, visuospatial functioning, which is just the ability to have things and objects in your mind and be able to like rotate them and put them in different ways. So like playing with Legos would be a pretty good example of visuospatial functioning. So you see there's different intelligence tests where you rotate blocks in different ways. Basically, you see some declines with age there. But yeah, just in general, there's a whole bunch of different fields of study. And the idea here is just to introduce you to a lot of the major concepts. This isn't something where I expect you to be able to memorize every single different thing and how they change and how they don't. But the idea is to start here with a large overview, just so you're familiar with terms like visuospatial processing, all of these types of memories, all the different types of attention, and some of the major moderating variables, because all the things that we talked about here in this lecture we'll revisit in a lot more depth, and we'll apply it more to everyday situations and just life in general. So I hope that you found this lecture interesting and that it made the reading a little bit more, I don't know, palatable, because it can be difficult reading these scientific papers. So thank you so much for paying attention. And I look forward to talking to you in the next lecture.